Final reading of Senate Bill 2785, House Draft 2, relating to inter-island electric transmission cable systems.
Discussion. Senator Gabbard.
Mr. President, I rise in support of SB 2785.
Please proceed.
SB2. Colleagues, consider this. The concept of inter-island undersea cables is not a new idea. We've been talking about this since 1881. Yes, 1881, in that year, King David Kalakaua met with Thomas Edison in New York to discuss geothermal power from volcanoes in Hawaii and using undersea cables to carry power between the islands. And here we are today looking to move ahead with this concept some 131 years later. It's said that the wheels of government turn painfully slow, but this is ridiculous. Please allow me to lay out the situation that Hawaii faces. First, some simple math. And to be clear, I barely squeaked out of bird brain college math with a passing grade, but even I can understand these numbers. Hawaii spends $4 to $6 billion every year importing foreign oil. Last year, it was $5.09 billion, buying over 46 million barrels of oil. This is, in a word, stupid. Why? Because we have unlimited amounts of world-class sun and wind. We have Tutupele on Hawaii Island, ready and waiting to share her geothermal energy with us. Ocean thermal, wave energy, biofuels. It's all built in here, part of our natural resources. We depend on imported oil to generate 77% of our electricity needs compared to the national average of 1%. We must use low sulfur oil, mostly imported from Indonesia, where prices are about $30 to $35 per barrel higher than posted commodity prices for oil. This leaves us continually facing the highest electricity prices in the nation. The volatility of oil prices makes our economic situation very vulnerable, given that a big spike in oil can have a catastrophic impact on our way of life. We must continue advancing our goal of greatly reducing our dependence on fossil fuels and ramping up our use of the incredible renewable energy resources that Keakua has provided for us. This bill is the result of a 2-year-long collaborative effort between the consumer advocate, DBED, HECO, the PUC, the legislature, and administration. Passage of this bill does not mean that an inter-island transmission cable will be built. But if a cable is built, this bill authorizes the PUC to regulate any cable as a cable utility. This bill does not short-circuit the environmental review process. Any cable developer must still go through the environmental process. The bill does not leave out public input. In fact, this bill specifically requires the PUC to hold a public hearing on each affected island. The question has arisen as to why do we need to do these big renewable energy products? Why not just put solar panels on every home and business in the state? While most of you know I am totally in support of making this happen, the truth is we need both distributed energy generation and the bigger utility-scale projects to harness geothermal and wind energy. For example, based on our clean energy goals, if we maximized our use of solar energy, we could provide roughly only 17% of the electricity needed statewide. Our islands depend on each other in many ways. In the case of renewable energy, the neighbor islands are blessed with more natural resources. Oahu, with the largest concentration of people, has the greatest energy demands. But at the same time, Oahu helps the neighbor islands through its broader tax base to fund schools, roads, other infrastructure, and social services for those islands. It makes sense for our islands to be interconnected. This will allow us to strengthen and improve our electricity grids and at the same time enable us to levelize our electricity rates. In other words, ratepayers on connected islands would pay the same rate. Colleagues, while the discussions may have begun with a simple tie from a wind project to Oahu almost 5 years ago, the concept has evolved to a better understanding of the benefits that could come from an Oahu grid to Maui grid connection. Maui is becoming increasingly important as the hub for renewable energy development potential, as well as interconnection point with Maui County and in the future to Hawaii Island. Again, passage of this bill ensures that if there's any cable development in the future, it would be subject to regulation by the PUC as a cable utility. I ask that you join me in voting for this measure. Mahalo.
Senator Baker.
Thank you, Mr. President. In support.
Please proceed.
While I rise in support of this measure, I want to acknowledge some of the legitimate concerns that have been raised by folks on Molokai and Lanai. As a neighbor islander, it's easy to feel like the concerns of our small, rural, and less populated islands get short shrift from our big sister on Oahu. For some neighbor islanders, information may be hard to come by. It's expensive to fly over for face-to-face meetings, and sometimes it feels like things are being done to us, not with us. Out of respect for those concerns, I had hoped that we would be able to conference with the House on this bill, and I thank the chair of the Energy Committee for honoring that request. Then we could have developed what I thought would be a clear policy statement about where the cable would go and the need for community consensus, as the Senate draft had provided in the bill's preamble. Our language stated, "Nothing in this act is intended to require the construction of an inter-island cable from the islands of Molokai and Lanai to Oahu, unless the communities affirmatively request an inter-island cable." Such a simple sentence to acknowledge the concerns. The House draft was more generic. "Nothing in this act is intended to require the construction of an inter-island cable from any particular island." From the beginning, we've tried to provide opportunities for input from communities potentially affected by this measure. That's why we started with a fresh bill this session rather than going back to conference on last year's bill. It was important to vet the measure thoroughly and hopefully provide clarity and understanding in the process. I felt written acknowledgement and a conference committee report would advance that clarity and understanding. Unfortunately, the House did not agree to conference on this matter, and we are here today to vote on the final version of the bill, including the amendments made by the House to Senate Bill 2785. This bill, as our lead conferee and chair of Energy noted, establishes the regulatory framework for developing, financing, and constructing an underwater transmission cable. It is important to note, however, what this bill doesn't do. It does not require that an underwater transmission cable be built, nor does it specify that certain islands will be the subject of any potential cable. Also, as I'm sure we're all aware, underwater transmission cables have been deployed in other places around the world, and our discussion, as the chair of Energy noted, in Hawaii's waters is not new. As we move forward to a more sustainable energy policy, it is important to be open to projects like this one to help our state achieve its goals. Currently, each island has its own electrical grid, and there is no interconnectivity among the islands like you would find among different jurisdictions on the mainland. As Hawaii moves to develop more alternative energy resources like expanded geothermal power, it may be prudent to provide for the interconnection of these electrical grids to ensure that all of our power needs are met. It is desirable that the regulatory framework established by this bill be in place so that any potential bidder for a cable project know just exactly what the rules of the road are, what the expectations and outcomes need to be before they sink money into developing a bid. The provisions in this measure will help to ensure that any project selected would be commercially reasonable as well as feasible. I simply don't subscribe to renewable energy at any cost, and thankfully, neither does the PUC. Again, Senate Bill 2785 provides a pathway towards an underwater transmission cable, but it does not in any way mandate one. Although this bill is important for Hawaii's energy future, attention must be given to the concerns raised. Maui Island has excess power and the capacity to produce more. Maui Island, I believe, is poised to become an energy exporter. For any cable project that moves forward, my preference, and hopefully that of all of our colleagues, would be to establish a grid-to-grid cable that one day could tap the abundant geothermal on the Big Island and the excess wind and other power from Maui Island and connect to energy needs on Oahu. Such a grid-to-grid project would provide the benefits of a reliable, interconnected major islands grid that would allow ratepayers the benefits of the economies of scale and not be a burden to any one individual community. Any project that goes forward, in my opinion, must be Pono. It simply must be commercially feasible and not saddle ratepayers with unreasonable cost. Fortunately, I'm sure and I know that the PUC shares my concerns about the cost of electricity and the desire for affordable rates. They've demonstrated as such that commitment already in turning down a project that would have been costly using unproven technology on the Big Island. Senate Bill 2785 provides the framework under which an inter-island cable can be considered, vetted, and proposals for deployment reviewed and evaluated. As part of our overall strategy to achieve energy security and independence from imported fuel, I believe such a cable should be thoroughly explored as a way to connect the grids of the major islands in our state. Because I believe there is merit to such an orderly, considered, open dialogue on the merits and concerns regarding an inter-island cable, that is why I will vote yes on Senate Bill 2875, House Draft 2. Mahalo.
Further discussion. Senator English.
Mr. President, I rise in support.
Please proceed.
At the same time, I have to express the reservations of my constituents on Molokai and Lanai towards this bill. And quite frankly, what it comes down to was lack of clear dialogue with them, which has led us to this point. Now let me be clear. The idea of a undersea cable between our islands has been one that we have talked about for a very long time. In 2002, when we passed the landmark legislation that created the renewable portfolio standards and also set forth Hawaii's pathway towards renewable energies, we talked about an inter-island cable. Fast forward to today, 10 years later, Maui has become the energy hub. If you look at the energy being produced on Maui, we have excess wind. We have wave energy being explored. We have biomass. We have solar, photovoltaic. All of these energies are being produced, but what is the one thing that we do not have? We don't have an abundance of firm power backup. Many of my constituents in Haiku, in Makawao, Pukalani, Kula, who have wanted to put in photovoltaic systems on their homes have been told no by the utility because the grid has too much renewables on it. The grid has become unstable. What this cable will do for us on Maui is that it will provide the firm power backup that we need to enable all of these technologies to go. So to be very clear, Maui seems to be the hub. Maui will produce the energy, and I have to add geothermal. In Hawaii, we have a situation where most of the renewable energy is on the Big Island and Maui, and most of the need is on Oahu. We have reverse situations. Oahu does not have the renewables and yet has the firm power backup. The Big Island and Maui has the renewables, but we do not have the firm power backup. It makes sense to do a cable between these islands. I'm only sorry that we had to go through such a convoluted path to reach this point. I want to thank all of you for receiving the emissaries and the missions of the people of Molokai and Lanai to your offices to hear their points of view, to understand that these small communities really don't want to be overrun by large wind farms, by large energy-producing technologies. They want to simply exist and simply be a part of our society and contribute, yes, but not become the engine, not become the power plant for the rest of the islands. The reality is, with the advent of Kahiava Wind Farm on Maui, with Oahi Wind Farm on Maui, that we will have ample wind energy from that island. with the advent of all of the other technologies coming on, Maui will be the island, along with Hawaii. And I cannot forget to include the Big Island. These two islands will be the engines that are needed to supply the energy for Oahu. And we cannot forget that the energy from Oahu, the firm power from here, will support all of our renewables on the neighbor islands. So with that, members, I want to thank you for bearing with all of us during the last few years as we went through this. But I especially want to say mahalo to the people of Molokai and Lanai for enduring this, for the real fear and the real kanalua and the real mix-up inside that they feel. Because, you know, think about it. If someone wanted to come to your home and put in something, the biggest thing that you would ever see in your backyard, you would have these same feelings too. So I want to thank them for enduring this and for understanding all of what we went through, and most importantly, for becoming active voices and making sure that their point of view is heard. They did a very good job lobbying, coming down, talking to all of you, and again, I thank you for receiving all of them. Thank you, Mr. President.
Further discussion. Senator Sloan.
Thank you, Mr. President. Colleagues, I rise in opposition to this bill.
Please proceed.
I was privileged to be visited on several occasions by members of the neighbor islands, particularly Lanai and Molokai. In fact, we acknowledged them in our gallery this morning. I didn't just see them, I listened to them. And what they have to say makes a lot of sense. And while it is true, we can go back many years and talk about we've had this idea and that idea, and it's been a long time. I think part of the problem is in this process that has systematically cut the people out of the decision making and made it more difficult for them each and every time. The good senator from Maui talked about Oahu being the big sister. I look at Oahu as being big brother. And I think that for too long now, we have kind of mixed emotions in this very body. In some cases, we don't like what Oahu does, and we all band together for the neighbor islands. But when there's something that there is a benefit to some of our favored people within the community, then we say, thanks for your input, but no thanks, we're going to go ahead. The fact that we didn't go into conference, the fact that we accepted the House version, the fact that the public had no input in further deliberations tells me that there's something wrong with the project. And when you have to spend so much time, year after year, trying to convince the people that this is good for you, take it, like it, get used to it, then there's something wrong. It's our job to make the project understandable, to talk about it in ways in which it's a win-win situation. That is not the case with this bill. And by the way, just listening to the discussion over the last few minutes, I didn't hear talking about just the PUC framework. I heard how we're going to go ahead with the cable, and we're going to have the grid, and we're going to unite everybody together, and we're going to use all of the resources of the neighbor islands, primarily to benefit Oahu. That's what I heard. Now, possibly I'm wrong. But then I look at the people that are supporting this bill and the organizations, and they've never wavered. They want this bill. They want the taxpayers, the government, the ratepayers to be on the hook for this particular project. Now, some of you know I'm an economist by trade, and I certainly acknowledge and believe in economies of scale. It certainly can be good. But here we are in Hawaii with the highest electric rates in the nation, with the neighbor islands having even higher rates than we do here on Oahu. We talk about clean energy, we talk about alternatives, but in the meantime, we do everything possible to help our single monopoly utility. And in every bill where they're involved, we make sure that not only do they get a guaranteed rate of return, but we're going to give them an even higher rate of return. And we're going to add surcharges and more profitability to this monopoly. This utility monopoly should be deregulated and people should have choices. And while the grid is a good idea overall, connecting the islands, we've also learned on the mainland and other places that if you have everybody hooked up to one grid and all dependent on that, if that grid goes down for any reason, natural or unnatural, then everybody in the state is disconnected, with all the uncertainties and all the problems with individual electric and utility distribution by county. At least you've got that independence. And I've raised the issue before about the technology of putting this $2 to $3 billion cable. I know we're talking $1 billion, but I'm talking realistic economic figures. It's $2 to $3 billion undersea cable. We've been told that we have cables all around the world. We have cables in Hawaii, and that's true, but none to the extent and to the depth as this cable would be. I've even had the environmentalists come in and worry and be concerned about the effect of the cable on our mammals, on whales, on dolphins. I don't know whether that's true or not. I remember when some of these same groups raised a hue and cry with the U.S. Navy about what the effect the sonar and their instruments were having on these mammals, and I know that the United States Navy has now made changes in its policies. The good senator of the Energy Committee mentioned the other day that, you know, even if we don't pass this bill, private developers could go ahead. No, they can't. No, they won't. First of all, there would be adequate public input. But more importantly, if they could go ahead, the private developers would have done this years ago. They don't go ahead because they need the fiscal backing of the state. They need the power to the utility to guarantee that the ratepayers will continue to pay even more and take it in the shorts. And that's what this bill does. This bill guarantees that that's the path we're on, that this legislature, this Senate, is behind this. And boo-hoo from the people of the neighbor islands. Yeah, we listen to them, but we're going to ignore them. They have not had an opportunity for full and open discussion and debate. And while the PUC may have made some good decisions in the minds of many, the PUC is a changing body. And who knows who will be appointed in the next couple of years or what decisions they will actually make. So here we are with a project that does not have public support, does not have the opportunity for thorough examination in a conference committee. We could not obviously get the House to come to the conference table and change some of their ways, just like we couldn't get them to agree to a well-reasoned Senate CIP. So what's the rush? Why do we go ahead now? Why don't we listen to the people? Why don't we take the time to get real input on each island and find out if there are other things and other ways to do this rather than to bow down to the monopoly utility as we seem to always do? Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator Sparrow.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to rise in support of this measure.
Please proceed.
No, it is not unexpected that we're going to have individuals who are against this measure. And the residents of Molokai and Lanai have been heard. And all the other advocates who are against this have been heard. But this is an important discussion for the state of Hawaii that will affect us for generations to come and for decades to come. Alternative energy for our state. I believe the figure that's been thrown around is approximately $7 billion is spent each year to purchase oil. Now, if we're spending $7 billion and the cost of this undersea cable, which has not been decided yet, let's make that clear. It is not going to be built next year. It's not going to be built in 2 years. It's not going to be built in 5 years. So the discussion is just beginning on one of the most important issues facing our children and grandchildren. Many people remember when gasoline was $1 a gallon. The elderly, the kupuna, of course. Our generation, $3 to $4 a gallon. Imagine when gasoline, and it will be, colleagues and guests, gasoline will be $6 a gallon, $7 a gallon, $8 a gallon. And the desire and need for alternative energy will be so important that all forms of energy will be considered. Again, this is the beginning of that discussion. Nothing will happen overnight. The people of Molokai, Lanai, and the neighbor islands will be heard. They have been heard. And this is the beginning. This sort of reminds me of the rail debate that began 30, 40 years ago. 30 or 40 years ago. We've been talking about alternative energy for decades, as the senator from Maui suggested. And yet, how much closer are we to reaching that 70% that has been stated, of which 30 or 40% is conservation? This is a bill that begins the discussion and keeps it firmly alive. And we know those who are opposed are going to be at the forefront to make sure it is done right and properly. I urge all of my colleagues to support this bill. Thank you.
Further discussion? If not, Senator He.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise in opposition.
Please proceed.
I've waited the whole session to agree with the minority leader. He finally makes sense. But before rising in opposition, I wanted to ask the chairman of Energy, who I'm sure only was kidding when he said he had a bird brain college math, because I know he doesn't have a bird brain college math degree, but I want to ask him, the minority leader suggested that the project would be $2 to $3 billion. What would the cable cost if it were to be built today, as opposed to the majority floor leader who said 5 years from now? What would a cable cost? Would you ask the chairman of Energy to yield?
Senator, would you like to yield to a question?
Yes, the cost, as the minority leader pointed out, the estimate at this point is $1 billion.
Senator He.
Thank you, Mr. President. I wasn't sure if that's $1 billion in 2011 dollars, or $1 billion in, 2012 dollars, or $1 billion in 2017 dollars. But no matter, a billion is a billion, as the economist, minority leader has indicated. That I'm presuming, and I would happy to be corrected, that the cost of the installation of the cable would be borne by the ratepayers, and by extension, therefore, by the taxpayers. I'm also presuming that the chair of Energy, who characterized Tutu Pele as waiting and willing to share, he must have a pipeline to Tutu Pele. I frankly find that a little offensive. Any suggestion that this is pono, I find offensive. Actually, I find it tragic, not offensive. I have been here long enough to have lived through the super ferry, which is a connector of Oahu to neighbor islands, that out of that debacle to rush avoid environmental and other review, clearly enunciated the hostility between neighbor islanders and Oahu people. The best example of which emanated from the rule of no coolers allowed on trucks, and then was graphically displayed when one of the first super ferry cases were 3 trucks from Oahu, which were confiscated at Kahului loaded with imu stones. The interconnector called the super ferry resulted in graphic hostility between neighbor islanders and Oahu. I think many of you know I have lived on Molokai, still own a house there, and but for that island, I would not be here. I think it's time to change the way we think in Hawaii. I think it's time to take a lesson from other islands who learn to go without. I have a generator in my upper barn. And that's so when the electricity goes out, I fire it up so the refrigerator stays cold. I haven't used it since I bought it several years ago, because I figured out when electricity goes out, better to sit quietly and wait for it to come back on. As soon as I scrape up enough money, I'll put a PV system on my roof so that instead of paying whatever I do pay, I can be like my neighbor who pays $20 a month to HECO. 16. That seemed like a more economical way to proceed as civilized people who may or may not have a bird brain college math degree. It's not stupid, as was later shared with this board, this august body. In fact, it makes perfect sense. I don't think that this bill does anything more than encourage the development of a system and discourage common sense thinking on how to proceed. This reminds me of the mayoral debate ongoing, and I believe common sense will prevail in August, and if not August, in November. That way, this issue will be given a fair evaluation on what taxpayers think of higher rates for an interconnected system that should not be passed at this time. I vote no. Thank you.
Further discussion. Senator Gabbard.
Mr. President, brief rebuttal.
Please proceed.
First of all, I would like to apologize to the senator from Kahului if I have offended him, and the remarks that I made were not intended to offend or to be considered tragic. Also to address some of the points that were made by the senator from East Honolulu. Early November of last year, we had a listening tour of the islands of Molokai and Lanai. There were members of the Senate as well as members from the House who were present. We made it clear to all who came to the community meetings that we were not there to jam any legislation down their throat. We simply came to listen. So we got their input, and I shared it with my colleagues. The impression that I've gotten from the legislators from Hawaii Island is they very much favor, in some of the legislation that has been introduced, the sharing of Madam Pele's energy with all of the islands. I want to remind you all, colleagues, that this bill simply says that if a cable is built, it will come under the purview of the PUC. That is all that this bill says. That is what we're deciding today. So I urge you to vote yes. Mahalo.
Further discussion. Senator Stone.
Just a brief rebuttal, Mr. President.
Please proceed.
Gee, as much as I would really like to jump to the bait and talk about rail, we want to get out of here sometime today, so I won't do that.
Thank you,
I do
Senator
acknowledge the good senator from Kahului. He's finally seen the light. He understands now. And with the movie Avengers coming out, I mean, the superheroes, what a terrific thing this would be, the two senators together. I just wanted to say that there is a difference between hearing someone and acting and listening on what they say. And I don't think that we have done that. We may have heard what they said, but we haven't done what they are asking. And then finally, maybe the good senator from Kahului and I could offer a floor amendment that would seek to capture the excess hot air and wind energy from this building alone and send it back to the neighbor islands across the... We don't even need an undersea cable for that, but I guess that's an argument for another time. Thank you, Mr. President.
Further discussion. Senator Solomon.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise in support of
Please
the
proceed.
legislation. Thank you. And I also rise in support of my Maui colleagues. I would like to commend them for their remarks. Mr. President, as you know, this issue has been debated in this legislature since 1982. The bottom line is, you know, we talk about $7 billion in terms that's being exported in fossil fuel. If you were to break that down, we're talking about $1.7 million a day that leaves this state. I was very much disappointed. I too would have liked to see the bill debated and conference between the House and Senate. I think that if we had gone through that process, we would have had a better bill. I feel very strongly that the Big Island has to be involved, no matter how we look at it, simply because geothermal energy, Mr. President, as you know, we've passed a bill where geothermal energy is going to be considered a firm power in this state. It really distresses me when people kind of use the word of Pele and the kinulau of Pele as, you know, something that is used to support a mana'o that really didn't come from the Hawaiian people. But I just want to make clear, you know, Pele, if one knows the story of Pele and her legendary sisters, you know, Pele bestows her powers, you know, on her youngest and favorite sister, Hi'iaka, so that Hi'iaka can help mankind. I think that this is the proper interpretation of the kinulau of Pele. Kinulau in Hawaiian means different manifestations of a god or goddess, and how this manifestation is seen in the real world. I think the problem with geothermal energy, Mr. President, has been how the resource has been managed from the time that we allowed geothermal energy till today. I feel that there's been many abuses of the power. You know, I never could understand, I mean, for the life of me, if we're talking about, I think the Big Island is at 42 cents, when in fact the resource of geothermal is at 8 cents. You know, and the question has always been, well, what's happening with the money between 8 cents and 42 cents? I think that these are concerns that we in this body seriously have to look at. This is why I was very pleased when finally on our Public Utilities Commission, we have people there that understand what we're talking about and understand the environmental perspective as to this resource. I agree with some of the remarks of the minority leader. I think a lot of this has to do with the monopoly that we've had here in our islands since the days of King David Kalakaua. This is how long we've been wrestling with these issues. And I really feel that the people of this great need to be liberated of what I call this kind of bondage that we've allowed our people to be a part of. of course, if I had my druthers, I'd rather see the line, the underwater sea cable funded, period. I think the underwater sea cable should be owned by the consumer of this state. The consumer should own the gate, Mr. President, not no private entity or private business. And the consumers of this state of Hawaii, Mr. President, would benefit in a very positive way in terms of decreasing their cost of energy. My thoughts, this is not something new. We've discussed this many, many times in this body, where utilities should be owned by the consumer. The grid, the expansion of the grid should be owned by the consumer. This is why, if you look back in '78 in the CONCON, this is why we allowed special revenue bonds. This is why we gave special revenue bonds to the public utilities, with the thought that when they improved the utility, the savings on those improvements would have been passed on to the consumer. Unfortunately, to this day, we've never seen any of those dollars going back to the consumer. I think that we are on a moment of a new day in Hawaii, so, you know, if you want to use that phrase of our governors, because as we look into geothermal energy, as we look into alternative energy, as we look into the savings that we could realize, that is truly a way of expanding our economy. 8 cents to 42 cents is a lot. And the consumer should be the beneficiary of those dollars, of those differences, in terms of cost production and distribution. I'm looking forward, if God willing, and many of us do return for next session, and I'm hoping that many of us do return, at least we have an institutional memory as to, or mindset as to how this can really become a reality for our people of Hawaii. So with that, Mr. President, again, I'd like to speak in support of our Maui colleagues. And yes, Maui and Hawaii at one time in Kamehameha Kingdom, we were united as one kingdom. And I'm looking forward to the day that we can, as it says in the famous Kaulana Napua, that we can eo and kako'o, our sister, here on Oahu. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Further discussion. Senator Green.
Thank you, Mr. President. Support very briefly. I support this bill because I see this as a way for the Big Island to become an energy exporter. I see it as a way for us to have lower rates long term, and I think that the people of our state really want and deserve clean energy, and there's no other way to achieve that without bringing us all together with an energy system that includes uniting all islands if they choose to opt in. I'm cognizant of the concerns of Lanai and Molokai. We're extraordinarily respectful and we'll protect their interests going forward, but I do think the Big Island will need to be connected to Maui and to Oahu over time to achieve our clean energy interests. Thank you, Mr. President.
Further discussion. Senator He.
Thank you, Mr. President. Again, speaking in opposition, I like the comments that I like most of the comments that have been shared, both in support, some in support, but clearly, I think that the comments that have been shared in support are one-sided. For example, the previous speaker, he makes good sense. And he says, that people can choose to opt in. Well, that's true. Only if they're forced to pay for the cable. Then you have no choice to opt in, because you certainly can't choose to opt out. And that's the to me that's the foundation of the issue here. Having lived on a small island, I can clearly understand what it is for people to be heard and not listened to. And you know, parenthetically, let me add, I remember when gas was 49 cents a gallon, and I'm not kupuna. Just because, but anyway, in any event, if the Big Island and Maui have all the energy and more, that's terrific. That's really terrific. The Big Island and Maui should be focused on why is their cost of electricity so high if they have an overabundance of energy? And why isn't Miko, I don't know, I think it's Miko, and I think it's Hiko. Oh, you get the idea. Why aren't they responding to the overabundance of energy? And if it's because their system cannot handle the overabundance of alternative energy, why isn't the discussion on handling the overabundance of energy so that Madam Pele, which was referred previously as Tutu Pele, can assist that island? The proliferation of housing on this island will continue with more energy. And the dependence, the mental dependence of people to energy will only exponentially grow. We don't need electricity. Our kupuna, and I use that with great reverence, got by without electricity. And I'm not suggesting that therefore we should go back to a kikepa and a malo, but rather redesign our thinking so that we take care of each other ourselves. This cable is emblematic of much more than an expensive cable that will end up costing everyone more. And I don't want to get into the rail debate, but you get the idea. Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator English.
Yes, again in support with reservations.
Please proceed.
I'd just like to make sure certain points are entered into our record. The first is that the Habis, Maui, and the Big Island, that the bill before us is a regulatory framework bill, and it lays out a framework. It does not authorize a cable. There's no bids before us for a cable. It simply sets up the governing regime for it. The second point is that the Big Island, or third point really, that the Big Island and Maui have an overabundance of renewable energy. And if you understand energy policy, when you have an overabundance of renewables, you make the grid unstable. This is what the utility companies are dealing with, an unstable grid, especially on the Big Island and now beginning on Maui. In fact, the wind production on Maui, Kahiava produces about 30% of our power. With the advent of Awahi wind, in the next few years, about another 15%, 20%. But at this point, they're already what's called curtailing. They're already stopping the windmills because there's too much intermittent power, not enough renewable, not enough firm power. That's why the concept of the cable becomes important. The production is on the Big Island and Maui. The need is on Oahu. If there is a link, all of that excess renewable power from the Big Island and Maui will be used on Oahu, and likewise, the firm power that's produced on Oahu will support Maui and the Big Island. As for Molokai and Lanai, and this is probably the most important point, the economics of it simply says that more than likely they will not be connected to any grid system. Simple economics. If the power is already produced on the Big Island in Maui and the need is already established on Oahu, who would finance something to put in both a cable and the wind generation when it already exists? So the economics, I think, will drive this one. And frankly, for Molokai at least, I'm excited watching what they're doing because they're looking at the cutting edge technology and looking at how they can create their own energy independence, and we need to support that vision. So to be clear, and to make sure that on the record we know that the intent behind this bill is to allow for the regulatory framework, nothing more, that this body has supported all along an opt-in option for Molokai and Lanai, and we continue to do so. Thank you.
Further discussion? If not, are there any reservations on this measure? Reservations for Senator Wakai, Fukunaga, Tokuda, Ryan, Ihara, English, Shimabukuro, Nishihara, Kim, and Ige. If not, do we have unanimous consent? No votes for Senator Sloan, Chun Oakland, and He. All others voting aye.
22 ayes, 3 noes.
Senate Bill 2785 HD2 passes final reading.